Do that.
I'll do that from, we'll do it from my end. That's all setting up now.
Do that.
I'll do that from, we'll do it from my end. That's all setting up now. All right. We are now live. Welcome tonight. My name is Myri from Lighthouse, Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. And it is an absolute joy and a delight to be chatting tonight with the wonderful Lynne Jones, author of Sorry for the Inconvenience, but This is an Emergency. We are going to have a wee talk from her, and then we're going to have a few questions, and then it will be over to you. Thank you for meeting us from all over the world. It's lovely to see the lively chat. Feel free to put your questions in there. And thanks for your patience while we got everything going. So I'm going to ask Lynne to start a video. So that's got a wee link that should, there we go. Hello.
I can't see myself now. Hang on. Oh, yes, right.
Oh, there we
Okay.
go. We can see you. I'm just going to give
Okay.
a wee bio for you, and then I'm going to hand over the hosting to you so that you can share your wonderful slides. Lynne Jones is a child psychiatrist, WHO and UNICEF consultant, an author of acclaimed books, including Outside the Asylum, which has long been a Lighthouse favourite. And then they started shooting. BBC Radio, The New Statesman, The London Review of Books, and the Oprah magazine have featured her field diaries from conflict and disaster areas. And this new book is an insider's account of our new era of mass protest. And it shows a lifetime of dedication to us fellow humans in the most wonderful, creative, and passionate ways. So thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for this brilliant book. And now I'm going to hand over the hosting to you so that you can take us on a whip round journey of the book. So here goes technology part 2. I'm making your host. There we go. So you should now be able to share your slides.
Hang on 1 second. We rehearse this so we know what we're doing. Okay. Step 2. And let's hope step 3 works. Right. You should see a slide. Is that right? You don't see my notes. Okay, great. So what I want to do in the next 15 minutes, and I hope it won't be longer, and if I am, I'll just stop and, we'll go on with questions, is share some of my personal stories and historical stories of nonviolence, past and present. Because really the reason for writing the book was to show what an extraordinarily powerful and diverse form of action it is. It's not just one thing. And in doing that, I also want to share some of the theory underpinning nonviolence as to what might make it effective and what excites me most today, because in spite of the gloomy times, I still believe it has the best potential for change. So I will start 40 years ago because I was completely terrified then by another existential threat called the threat of nuclear war, because Mrs. Thatcher's government had decided that our country would be the perfect place to deploy tactical nuclear weapons, which could actually be used in a time of crisis at the behest, not of our government, but at the United States, basically turning us into a nice sort of offshore shooting range. And so I resigned my job as a doctor to live outside one of the bases where she planned to put them. And we had very dramatic protests. The photos show you some of those. The first and most famous one was when, simply through a chain letter, yes, no Twitter in those days, we got 30,000 women to come and hang up the things that meant life to them on the fence and surround the base. And that action went global. And even though we had a blockade the next day, it was the visual encircling of the base that caught people's imagination and shifted the opinion polls in opposition to missiles from about 40% to about 60 to 70%. Unfortunately, that protest didn't stop the government a year later deploying the missiles and telling us we'd failed and it was time to go home. But we stayed. And we were reviled by the press, sounds familiar, subject to daily evictions, arrested, going to prison. And we started more serious, what I would call direct interventions, cutting the fence down, going in the base, causing trouble, nothing violent, but just being around, climbing on things and things like that. And then, most effectively, we actually stopped the missiles from working. How did we do? Oh, sorry, wrong slide. I'll go back. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I should be, I thought I had a picture of that. But what we did, now it is in the previous picture, excuse me. I will go back because you'll see we did block roads. I don't know if you can see that's blocking a road. That's a missile launcher. And the point of these weapons was that they would go secretly into the countryside. So the Russians didn't know where they were, and then they would be fired. And what Cruise Watch, which was a network of people around the country and the women at the base did, was make sure that not a single weapon was secretly deployed on any exercise, which meant that Jane's Defence Weekly was saying they're not working. And it meant that General Charles Donnelly was saying 25% of our exercises have been stopped by these women. So I think Mrs. Thatcher was just waiting for an excuse to get rid of them and was delighted when Reagan and Gorbachev actually did meet, sat down and talked, and a year later, in 1987, signed the first treaty, past treaty as well, unfortunately, to actually remove nuclear weapons. And Gorbachev said what made him prepared to meet with Reagan and negotiate with Greenham women and the wider peace movement because he trusted that we would hold him to account. So it was partly through us. So that made me feel very hopeful. And I really became really interested and did my PhD on nonviolence, in fact. And the more I looked at it, you know, people like Gene Sharp, who's perhaps the most famous academic exploring it, points out that action is not just about protest. It's about direct interventions, like getting into the base, stopping the missiles. It's about non-cooperation. And then one of the most famous examples of that, of course, is one of the ones that's often cited today. Rosa Parks sat down on a bus in a white person-only seat, a direct intervention, refused to get up. She was arrested. And what followed was one of the most successful boycott non-cooperation actions ever. People refused to use the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And that was a perfectly legal thing to do. But guess what happens when you do something legal and it's being effective and those in control don't like it? They tend to make it illegal. They didn't actually make the boycott illegal. They made the carpooling that the local Black population were doing so they could still get to work, even though they were boycotting the buses. They made that illegal. But it didn't work because the Constitutional Court boycott continued for 381 days, and the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. Wonderful action. An example of propaganda by deed, if you like. One of my heroes, early C&D activist, inspiring man, Michael Randall, I write about a lot in the book, says propaganda by deed is enacting what you want to happen. So you want unsegregated seats, you sit, you have freedom rides. You want unsegregated lunch counters, you have sit-ins at lunch counters. These are really good examples of propaganda by deed, and I think one of the most effective forms of non-violent action. People say, well, isn't it about civil disobedience? And that those are certainly examples of civil disobedience, and they take place in at least nominal democracies. So I thought this is the only wordy slide I give you, don't worry, but I do like this definition and it's in the book. And it's really important because John Rawls is a philosopher who argues and points out that civil disobedience helps to maintain and strengthen democracy, not undermine it. I wish that Mr. Gove and Mr. Sunak were listening to this talk, because laws can be wrong. Society as a whole can be wrong. And what civil disobedience does, what activists like Rosa do, is they come along and say, we're breaking this law because we want you to see that it's completely unjust. And we're prepared to sacrifice, to suffer. And we want you to have a look at the wider injustice and maybe change the law. And that's what happens. That is what civil disobedience can do. And it's happened here. This is rather a forgotten action, but it's absolutely brilliant. A bunch of young men, I was taught about them at school, but I wasn't taught that they were communists, but they were. A bunch of young men decided that really there was too much private land, sounds familiar, owned by very rich people in Britain, and they wanted the right to roam, and they wanted to go for walks. So again, propaganda by deed. What did they do? They went for a walk on Kinder Scout in 1932, and they were arrested, and they were given really punitive sentences. And there was an outcry, and that action helped establish the public rights of way that we have today and the national park systems that we enjoy. Now, I know it's not perfect, but without this act of civil disobedience, we wouldn't have what we have. Amazing. And another lovely example of direct intervention that I'm just basically telling you stories is Greenpeace. Great actions that they do all over the place, but I really like this one because it's so simple, and it happened off the coast of Cornwall where I live. So marine protected areas, we don't have enough of them, and the ones we do, we've got bottom trawlers going along and trawling and really destroying the ecosystem on the seafloor. So what did Greenpeace do? Completely simple, didn't harm anyone. If you like propaganda by deed again, they dropped boulders into the area so that they didn't damage the ground, but the bottom trawlers could not work. They're not working in that particular protected area, nor off the coast of Sweden, where it's happened again. And what we hope is that actually there will be a ban on bottom trawling in these areas. And now I'm going to tell my favorite story, because this is the way this story shows how one action by one woman can actually, it's part of a wider movement, but it's her decision and how it can escalate to have enormous effect. So one of the early, before I got involved in Greenham, I was deeply involved in anti-apartheid, although I didn't know about this particular action. But the main strategy of anti-apartheid was boycotts. And all sorts of people said, right, we are going to boycott South African goods, including Mary Manning's trade union, shop workers' trade union in Ireland. And Mary Manning worked at the Dunn Street stores in Dublin. So she was a supportive trade unionist. And when a shop customer came up with 2 grapefruits and said, I want to purchase these grapefruits, she noticed that the 2 grapefruits came from South Africa. And she said, well, I'm very sorry, but we're boycotting South African goods, so I can't cash these. And the customer was incensed and demanded to see the manager. And the manager said to Mary, I'm sorry, but you've got to sell the grapefruits. And Mary said, well, I'm not going to sell grapefruits. And then Mary's shop steward came along and said, I'm supporting Mary, and she doesn't have to sell the grapefruits. And so they were both suspended. What happened then? The other workers in the shop all went on strike. Just 12 people, who cares? They went on strike for 3 years. Other people came out in support of them. They were invited to South Africa by Desmond Tutu. The South African government was then very foolish and refused to let them in, which meant their story went international and they were invited to the UN. And the government of Ireland was a bit embarrassed, and they decided that they too would boycott South African goods. And in 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, he came over to Ireland to thank them. It's a tiny part of a wider action, but it shows how much difference individuals can make. And it shows the power of boycotts and divestment. And Desmond Tutu did point out 10 years ago that if we adopted these tactics, we could bring down the fossil fuel industry. And what I love about them is that these actions that every one of us in every workplace can take, and at least to an extent, they're not illegal. And when institutions do them, it's even more powerful, which is why the government is considering a law to try and make it illegal for at least government-owned institutions to do it. But that won't stop it. And there are lots of institutions over which the government has no control. Maybe your workplace, maybe your bookshop. Where do you bank? Where is your money invested? Where do you personally invest? We managed to get the Royal College of Psychiatrists to divest in 2020. One of just a few Royal Colleges, general practice, emergency medicine, I think accident and emergency, all divested. We're now working on them with the support of the UK Health Alliance to get them to move their bank accounts. And just saying no is such a simple thing to do. I mean, a sugar boycott in the 19th century, initiated by a woman, of course, Elizabeth Hayrick, contributed, didn't end the slave trade, but was part of it. And one of the things the fossil fuel industries do is they get traction through cultural sponsorship, which is why cultural boycotts like resignations, Mark Rylance resigning from the Royal Shakespeare Company, followed by children writing this amazing letter to the RSC saying, drop BP. And what did drop BP do? They dropped their sponsorship. We've done pretty well with a few institutions. We'd like the Science Museum to drop Adani. That's a whole story. Maybe somebody will tell it who's in the audience. Caroline Dennett, amazing, saw Extinction Rebellion demonstrating in the lobby of Shell and realized that it was completely, she supported them, completely inconsistent for her to be working for the company, and very prominently resigned. She's now involved in a boycott of paying sewage charges on your water bill, because you know about dirty water. And if you don't, I'm happy to discuss it. It would take a long time and I could explain the campaign to you. So boycotts, very good thing. Let's carry on. Yeah, here we got lawyers, wonderful organization. Lawyers are responsible and they are withholding their services from new fossil fuel projects, trillions of dollars in those kind of cases. And they are refusing to take action against climate protesters exercising their democratic right of peaceful protest. There was a lot of fury when this was announced, but they do have the right to do it, and it's very powerful. So I just thought I'd give you the information. I think so. The slides are there. Go to the website mothertree.com. It's a very simple form of action that every single one of you can take this evening. Check your bank's fossil fuel imprint. So Barclays is the worst. 2.9 tons of carbon per year, more than flying from the UK to Rome and back 14 times. Just if you have £12,000, not that many of us do, holding a current account, but you can work it out. And however little you've got, moving makes a difference. They hate it. I know this because when I arrived in my practice, my first job as a trainee GP in West Cornwall, and they knew who I was. They knew I'd been living at Greenham and they loved that. And they knew I was being anti-apartheid and they loved that. And then they paid me with a check from Barclays and I couldn't believe it. And I said, what? And they said, oh, okay, we'll have a practice meeting. And they did. And they said, right, we're moving the bank account. This was 1985. And the Barclays bank manager was incensed and wrote a letter saying how wonderful Barclays was and what good work they were doing in South Africa. A year later, we're just part of a big campaign. Barclays pulls its South African arm, ends its relationship with its South African bank. Another thing that makes me hopeful is not just illegal actions, and this is non-violent direct action, is the use of the law to increase climate justice. So what you've got now is actually people taking the government to court. You've got Chris Packham doing judicial review. You've got young people in Montana successfully suing the state government because the government is not protecting them from the effects of fossil fuels. And I think this is an enormously important area, and I spend a lot of time on it in the book. Now, I am not saying that roadblocks don't work. And my favorite example of roadblocks is the 106 days of continuous nonviolent protest that took place in Guatemala from the end of last year to the beginning of this year. And Guatemala had a nominal democracy, 40 years of really dictatorship by people who were voted to power in very unfair ways, what they call the corrupt pact. But finally, last August, they voted in a decent Democrat. And what did the corrupt pact try to do? Use the law to stop him from taking power. So the population of Guatemala took to the streets. And I love this sign, if you can see it on the slide. It basically says, so sorry for the inconvenience, but our democracy is being inconvenienced. And on the 13th of January, Arevalo was inaugurated as president because of this consistent nonviolent protest. I'm just going to come to an end. I tell you these stories because today is not a good day for nonviolent activists, because yet again, and I hope we'll discuss this in discussion, the space, this is not in my book, obviously, because it happened today, but every day there's a feeling that the space in which we can act gets restricted, because one of the wonderful things that's been happening, and this is in the book, is that juries and magistrates have been acquitting those doing nonviolent direct action civil disobedience, and the government doesn't like that. So twice they've moved to restrict the kind of defences that can be used in court. And just have a look at this article. Guardian's covering it, Independent's covering it, Financial Times, whatever paper you want to read, is covering the fact that yet another defence has been removed today, so that there's less chance of people who are breaking the law being acquitted. I can go again into that in detail. But I don't want to end there, because in my book, I say the lifeboats are out there. There are good things happening all the time. This lifeboat is called the Solomon Brown, and I tell the story in the book because this is the village I live in. The Solomon Brown, 8 crew members gave up their lives to save 8 other people, and they unfortunately all drowned. And lifeboats mean a lot in our village because these people come from our village, but they mean a lot to me too, because I just love the Lifeboat Society, and I love what they. How am I for time, Mary? Am I okay? Am I good? Yeah. So what I wanted to say is that the wonderful chief executive of the Lifeboat Society, I just have a quote he loves, when faced with now Nigel Farage saying, well, you've become a kind of rescue service for migrants, and I work a lot with migrants in Calais, in Italy, in Greece. He said, anyone can drown, but no one should. And that's become a kind of slogan in my head. We have to rescue anyone and everyone. And especially if you're a health worker, I think we have a duty of rescue. And the lifeboats are out there. The UK universities, 21 universities, are threatening banks over their fossil fuel funding. Chris Packham is taking the government to court because of their failures. And I hope he's going to win. Just a couple of days ago, nonviolent action all over Europe. Okay. Again, direct intervention, blocking access to North Sea oil infrastructure. I actually asked the question in the book, why are we not doing this? And then yesterday, I read that we are doing it. So it's amazing what's happening. It's funny, some people, aren't you failing? Where's Extinction Rebellion gone? Well, it would appear to be everywhere. What's happened is the media's not covering it. But I actually think if you sat down and looked at what was happening globally, including in Africa and Zambia and Uganda and India, everywhere, you'd see that there's much more action than there was when I was beginning this book, not less. So over to you. I hope I haven't talked too much.
That was wonderful.
I have, because
we started late.
9:30. So okay.
No, you're good. You're good.
I'm just trying to stop this.
It perfectly set the scene. So thank you for that. It's such a whip round, and the book is so extraordinary in the way you drill down on individual anecdotes, individual events, and again, that idea of people digging where they are I mean, the book is so full of examples, which made me so hopeful as a reader, because people were coming at problems in whatever way they were able to, whether that was as a lawyer or as a doctor or some, wherever you are, you have that capacity to bring. So I wanted to pick up on a few things. One of which is, as you say, these actions are taking place in so many places at the moment, in little ways, and not getting media coverage. One of the areas that is getting media coverage is where the media knows reliably there's backlash. Whether that's Just Stop Oil's road sitting or, wherever they can have a good whinge. And I think the book is full of great examples of counteracting that narrative by, for me, there were 3 real strands. One was the way you talk about doing no harm, that civil disobedience would be rooted in this idea of doing no harm, that you pick the right targets, which makes it harder for the media to veer into something else, and that you get the right communication and create the right space to communicate what it is that you're doing. So I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about this idea of do no harm. When we're up against this mammoth task, what does it mean to you as a doctor and as an activist to say, that your actions should do no harm?
I can give you a beautiful example, which didn't get media coverage at the time, and it should have done. 6 colleagues of mine, I've got the number right, decided during the heat wave of 22 that in July, do you remember? It got very hot and heat kills. I can't remember the exact figure, it's in the book, in the 60,000 extra deaths, I think they later calculated for that year. So my friends decided that they would do what I thought, again, was an incredibly powerful action of propaganda by deed, which was, you know, you're familiar with fire alarms. I have one up in every department I've ever worked in case of emergency, break the glass, all right? Well, who's one of the biggest funders of fossil fuels? It's JP Morgan. And we'd already done a corpse action the previous year, which is again described in the book, a sort of drama to show the effect that JP Morgan was having. And actually, I love doing that action. I'll just backtrack a bit because, again, it was propaganda by deed. And I had investors, not JP Morgan, but from the area, it's full of them, coming out and talking to me and saying, this action is an act of communication. You know, you've got people inside the building asking what's going on and talking. And the same happened with an oil and money action. I can come back to that. But this very powerful action, there's a small number of people, and they very carefully assessed that they would not hurt anybody. The damage would be limited, rather similar to other actions. They'd break the glass with a hammer, and it would symbolize the danger and draw attention. They hoped as health workers that they would draw attention to the damage being done by heat. That did not get the press coverage it deserved, but for me, it showed if it had, it was an act of communication. The court case is coming up, and I hope the court case will give it the publicity it needs. Now, they face a big challenge now because of in the 2 years, and I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me if you take an action at one point, then the law changes since you took the action, does that not count? I want some barrister or some lawyer to tell me, excuse me, the law I broke, you've now invented new legislation that didn't exist when I broke this law. How does that play in? But I'm not a lawyer. If there's one on to call, please tell me. But it's such a great action. I'll give you another, if I can too. Again, health workers, an example of taking such care. 2 friends of mine, again, went to the Museum of Natural History, and to just stop all action, they spray painted very carefully with completely non-toxic, completely harmless, completely washable powder orange paint, a dinosaur. Now, they drew attention to extinction, and then they sat down. Now, nobody came to arrest them, right? People were fascinated, people watched. No damage was done to the dinosaur. The Natural History Museum said as much the next day. They were allowed to leave. They weren't stopped. It was only after, and you can imagine some bigwig in an office, someone going, oh my God, how could you let them leave? And they were asked to come back. And then they were arrested, okay? But when it went to court, now one of my colleagues pled not guilty because he's a busy hospital consultant with a lot on his plate, but he wasn't found guilty. He pleaded not guilty to get the charge out of the way, completely understandable in his situation. But the other took the case to court, and the magistrate acquitted on the basis that the prosecution had not shown that there was a case to answer.
Right.
So magistrates, when you leave these cases in the hands of an intelligent judge, and I saw it with a blockade that I also document, again and again, magistrates acquit. Okay. When you get, one feels, judges who you wonder if they've been got at, because there are some judges who are not doing that. I document them in the book. It's no secret. Silas Reed, who, when I first came across him, seemed to be giving space to climate activists, has now moved to stopping the word climate be mentioned in court, putting people in prison for mentioning it, narrowing the legal space in which they can put their defense. It's frightening what's happening, but again, and have I answered your question? Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yes. Well, I think it's an interesting dance, that one with the law, isn't it? Where when the laws are just
a dance with the law is, but it doesn't feel like a dance if you're on the receiving end. It feels like enormous and frightening pressure. And I so admire my colleagues for putting themselves on the line like this. But it is it's a health emergency, and they're making that clear.
Yeah. And I think there is that element that other citizens are listening to the same news or hearing the same call. And if they are the magistrate or the jury given a chance, which is
given a
why,
chance, acquittals, acquittals, acquittals.
yeah, yeah, yeah. With
And
that in mind,
I just, sorry, if you're
no, go for it.
interested in this, you know, perverse verdicts have a long history, which I document a little bit. You know,
Yes.
juries have gone to prison for finding people not guilty. But as a result of that, the law has changed, you know, and it's thanks to what are called perverse verdicts that has happened. And we can only hope that juries go on doing that.
Yeah. That
in spite of in spite of being locked up by the judge for doing that, they've stuck it out.
But I think, again, it's despite a government's best attempts to reshape the law to counteract what is effective, because it is effective. You get
it's
the
not
action.
The first time. Before this discussion, I just quickly re-looked up the whole story around the 6 Acts. Again, it's good and it's bad. You know, Peterloo, people protesting to try and get representation in Parliament, fair representation. Manchester's a big city, doesn't have an MP. You live in New Hampshire and you have 3 or 4, but not just that, you don't have the vote. So you go out to protest on the street, you practice non-violent action. Extraordinary. They had practices then in the 19th century, and you get mowed down by the local yeomanry and people are killed. There's an outcry. There's protests all over the country. So what does the government do? It introduces new legislation to severely, only 50 people from the local parish can protest in a place at a time. Extraordinary. And you have to have permission. And you have to pay much more for a newspaper. And you can be sued for libel much more easily if you are a newspaper writer. I mean, basically, repression. The 6 Acts are really repressive. It does take time, but they are all repealed. And we do have the vote. It is part of the cycle, except we don't have so much time now.
Yeah, but I think it's important to, and this was something that was a recurring theme for me with the book, is it's important to know that those cycles exist. It's important to know what has been resolved and solved, or the timelines, or what worked, because in these spaces, we actually don't have time to keep reinventing the wheel. And your book does a really good job of doing that, of being like,
that's what I'm glad, because that's what I wanted to do. Say, look, guys, look at these stories. They're inspiring.
Yeah.
I'm just aware, can I just say, Noe, I see that it's 22, but I wanted to say, we started 10 minutes late. I'm free. I can continue over 8 o'clock. I don't know if the Lighthouse has rules, but just to say I'm available to continue beyond 8 o'clock.
Well, I think
I want people to have
Yes, we can run over, and then if anyone needs to head off early, they can always come back and watch the end of the video if they had to miss the end of it, because the recording will be up, which also means even if you don't have time to stay to have your question answered, do put your question in the chat. So it's a reminder to everyone who's watching, the chat's just below the video, and you can pop in whatever questions or comments you have, or if you've been involved in anything that Lynne has brought up that you have your 2 cents on. I want to take us to this idea of choosing the right targets, and what has worked and what hasn't, because that is, again, something that is a recurring theme in the book. How do you now, when you're looking at what is an effective target for an action, what goes into the thinking process, or when you're seeing someone else organize and you're questioning, is that the right pressure point? How are you gauging that? What advice do you have on what you've seen is effective?
First of all, I think it's really important that people look at the context in which they work and choose what works for them. I don't think it is really for me to tell other people what to do. But for me, do no harm is really important, and assessing. And again, when you read theorists, or you read, the assessing, for me, non-violent civil disobedience means not harming others. So does your action do harm to others? Now, then there's a question of what degree of disruption is harmful. Well, there's always going to be some disruption, some change. And I also think it's context. So I And an action that works one year, if it's repeated again and again and again, it may not work in a different context later. I mean, I do think, for example, that we have been affected, protests, whether they start with the pink vote in 2018, was it, or, you know, including Insulate Britain or road blockades over the first couple of years. There's no doubt they got attention. It might have been negative or positive, but they got attention. They're not getting so much attention now. And it may be that those, and I, you know, engaged in them. And it's interesting to me, the shift itself, you see, we don't, 80%, I think it is. I didn't look at the polls today, but something between 70 and 80% of the public are alarmed. So the question is, do we need to go on sounding the alarm, or do we need to be thinking more like people in 6 countries obviously did about direct interventions that actually stop the people doing what they're doing? I personally am heavily engaged in encouraging people locally and in the medical communities in which I work to divest and to boycott banks and to move. I think money is where it's at. So that's where I'm putting my energy. Also because it's something I can do without getting arrested, but it's definitely a direct action. And I think it's powerful, and the more of us who do it, the better. That doesn't mean I don't think that going out and stopping North Sea oil in the way these activists did is not important. It's just as important. And nor do I think roadblocks in every context are not good.
Right.
Look at what happened with in Guatemala, but also in a democratic country, a roadblock on The Hague. Again, the main road going to The Hague, 10,000 people blocked that road, I'm not sure for how long, but a considerable amount of time, faced enormous pressure from the authorities, but succeeded at that point in getting the Dutch Parliament to debate and consider withdrawing all subsidies for fossil fuels. Now, sadly, they've now reneged the debate. Look, it looked hopeful when I finished the book in October. It's a little bit less hopeful now, and I don't know what Dutch XR are considering doing. But you can't say that roadblocks, especially with large numbers of people for a strategic period of time of one road, don't work. They clearly did. So I can't sit here and say, oh, roadblocks don't work and this does. It's not like that. It's looking at where you are and what your target is and how to minimize harm to others.
I think that's yes, no, it is, because it is about strategizing, and it isn't one size fits all. And with that in mind, something that occurs over and over again in the work that you've done from Greenham Common to today, you write beautifully about the communication aspect of getting people to understand what it is you are doing and why you are doing, which means you have to have a coherent reason for doing it in the first place. And I wonder, in the context, for instance, the further we get away from the obvious, so Shell is an obvious target. When we target JP Morgan or Bailey Gifford or the investors who are giving money to our cultural institutions at a time when those cultural institutions are being starved of public funds and increasingly rely on that money, how do we negotiate that space of putting pressure on our cultural spaces and communicating to the people who use them that necessity for them to divest? Does that?
I think use communicative action. I mean, I was recently involved in an action, a very lovely action actually, but you know, it hasn't worked yet. The Science Museum is opening. It's a Darney Green Gallery, and the science Extinction Rebellion, Scientists Rebellion. They've been amazing in persistently and non-violently keeping pressure up on the museum, and they don't give up. And when you go and do an action there, it's extraordinary to me the way the security staff I've done 2 actions there now, both are kind of theatre type actions. One was where we gave talks around the gallery as to what was going on. Not many people paid attention, but we then gave talks outside the Science Museum, and that got a little bit more attention. And it's very interesting when we did an opinion poll with the public, what do you think of them being sponsored by fossil fuels? And the vast majority of the public were against. But then recently there was a panel discussion, fascinating, in which the 3 speakers acknowledged the climate crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
But not one of them mentioned the word fossil fuels. And in the audience, we had someone, wonderful doctor colleague, standing up with a banner, pointing out Adani's fossil fuel funding. We had somebody make a speech. Greta was in the audience, and we all planned to ask strategic questions. In fact, it was clear they were going to give us no question time. So there was a little bit of direct questioning type intervention at the end. So the speakers got up and left. And then there was a march around the gallery where, again, I noticed that the public were really interested. So that kind of powerful action gets the message across. And I think if you keep that pressure up, as with the RSC, I hope there would be, in the end, a shift. It's a kind of dialogue through action.
Right.
You see what I mean? Your action is the dialogue.
Yeah,
we're not going away.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that with in the books industry with groups like Fossil Free Books, who are, again, it's sort of picking the right pressure.
I don't know about that. So do you want to share it?
Well, I've been involved in some of the organizing, but none of the action so far. But Fossil Free Books is very much putting pressure on our festival circuit and the big arts festival, which are funded, in Scotland. One of the big investors is Baillie Gifford, and Baillie Gifford has money in the ECOP pipeline and in lots of other dirty places, but it's actually a small percentage of their portfolio. They have the capacity to divest and to do it relatively quickly, and they're choosing not to. And they're behind the Hay Book Festival, the Edinburgh Book Festival, Cheltenham, all of these big art festivals. And yet these art festivals are so starved of funding that there's that continual tension. And I think it goes to some of the things in your book, that thing of unions stepping up, writers' unions, who are the workers in the book trade who get to decide where their labor goes, so that Baillie Gifford gets the message festival after festival that, as you say, we're not going away. And I think it goes to, again, something that you reflect on in the book, which is that an increasing flexibility and creativity, rather than a fragmenting of these movements, that people are coming from different directions. I want to bring in a question.
Let's take questions.
Someone has asked from Jim, who says, "You sound incredibly optimistic, Lynne, but surely you must get depressed at times. What helps you get over such feelings?"
Yeah, I do. I mean, how can one not? It's really, really a tough time for so many reasons. I think two things. One is, I mean, writing the book helped me because I had to find, I want to be hopeful. I want to learn from the past. I love history. I'm old. I've been involved a long time, and reminding myself that I've been personally involved in succeeding against incredible odds. Both anti-apartheid and the anti-nuclear, the limited bit, because the missiles are coming back now, and my friends are out there at Lake and Heath. So I'm not saying success has to be maintained, but reminding myself about, at a point in 1984 when we were told, basically F off, and, you have lost, and benders were being burnt down, and people were screaming at us, and the press described me I was on the front page of the Daily Mail at the most horrific terms, and just, oh shit, being thrown at you, literally. And it went, and it was very cold, and it was very wet. And for me, even I wasn't there as long as my amazing friends. I went from 1982 to 1985. I got at the end of 1984, I went back into medicine thinking, well, if I don't go back, I'll not be able to be a doctor. So that was a choice I made. I still went on going up to the camp, but we won. Sometimes I can't quite believe that. And I remind, that's why I started with that story. But then I look at the anti-apartheid movement, and I look also at the power of singular people. I tell a story. I mean, I try to stick within liberal democracies, but actually when you look at the success of nonviolence in some of the most repressive situations, and you remember that the Cold War ended because of nonviolence. I mean, I don't know how old you are. I'm old enough to have gone from most of my friends in Poland being in prison and martial law imposed on the country to watching the slow fuse lit by solidarity bring down the Iron Curtain. There was no violence involved. And in another book, I've documented some of that, but it was extraordinary. I was in Berlin at the time. It was extraordinary. And none of us could believe what was happening. It was impossible to believe. But a whole continent changed because of nonviolent direct action. If we can end the Cold War, then I think we can do something about the climate and ecological emergency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you passed on a good deal of optimism to me with the book, because it was like, yes, we have victories, having that sense of history and time. Instead of being depressing, it shows so much of the victory, how we did win. Which brings me to a question from Noor, who's saying, is there a way that you decide that an action has not worked or needs changing in order to get the message across better? How do you decide?
And I think the best thing that happens, the sort of nonviolent discipline, it's been going on for as long as I've been involved, but if you do something, hopefully all of you who did it sit down afterwards and talk about what worked and what didn't work. And, you know, sometimes you come and think we should have done that because that really upset people, or, you know, really. I think I described one action at the end of the book. Some friends of mine were slow marching, and some people came up to them and said, actually, we're trying to get to our exams, you know, please. And immediately they dispersed, you know. I mean, you're not going to block young people trying to get to their exams. And you learn that. You learn, you know, you didn't have a strategy, well, if young people, because you didn't know it was going to happen. But you think the next time, you know, what are our criteria? Okay. Yeah, so I think always we learn as we go. I haven't personally been involved with an action I think was a total disaster. If I would have put an action I thought was a total disaster. I've given you examples of the press not covering things we thought would cover. So you need to think about why that is. But I don't think it's just about press. This is why I love the divestment movement. It's not, you know, whether the press covers us moving our bank accounts or not does not matter. What matters is word of mouth and getting the message out and doing it, because I can assure you the banks do not like it. They don't like it.
There's a question here from Rachel who's saying, with news changing so quickly, it feels like the momentum to change things like policies against the hostile environment can fade with a news cycle. Do you feel like movements can work with a small group of committed people? And if so, what makes them continue?
I love the end of the book because I think you need every kind of action, you need every kind of group. And maybe I'll end with a short reading, but a small group of people can be amazingly powerful. So take the Stansted 13, who I write about in the book, okay? They saved the lives, you know, they stopped people being deported. Actually, and I didn't put it in the book, and sometimes I'm sorry, I just couldn't cover everything. But another action that I love was either before or after the Stansted 13, a young woman on an airplane, do you remember? She started filming. She stopped the plane taking off because there was a single person being deported, and her filming herself, live streaming, saying, I'm standing up, I'm refusing, standing up, not sitting down, refusing to sit down. So this plane can't take off. So this person can't be deported. One person, one live stream, stop that, save that person from being deported. And then the Stansted 13, the stories told in the book. So small groups, look at Greenpeace, they do small group action. Some of the direct interventions that one might come up with need to be small group actions. The oil painting, the sunflower, famous, you know, paint on paintings action, which again, I was discussing, I'm an aid worker by profession. It's another reason I don't directly break the law, because I don't want to, one of the other implications of breaking the law is you can lose your visa to travel. And my work involves travel, but I was discussing that action in Guatemala. And that's how far it traveled. These things do go global. But then a bigger group can be, I love Fossil Free London's AGM actions that I was involved in last year. Again, you know, mild civil disobedience, a group, we worked together, we sang, colleagues of mine sang songs, I and Caroline Dennett asked questions. So it was a combination of different kinds of action. And it was a private facility, so they weren't breaking the law, they were just carted out the meeting, thought through, and I think an effective action. Well, effective, no, I'm sorry. Effective in terms of it got global publicity.
Right.
Shell is where it is. I'm sorry, I don't want to claim more success than we had. But we need to keep that pressure up. AGM season is coming, by the way.
Get involved in the AGMs. There's a question from Cora here who's saying, how do you onboard people into these movements? So are you involved in that sort of ambassador role? People come to you. How do you negotiate that?
No, I'm not an organizer. I belong to a small affinity group in West Cornwall, and you know, I'm not central at all. I support actions. I'm a leaflet. I write. I want to write about what people do so that we reflect on it and think about it and learn, but I'm in no way an organizer, so I'm the wrong person to ask. I'm not, well, we're not membership organizations, and I talk a little bit about the structure of movements in the book.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you want to join something, then take keywords and Google it, and you will find Extinction Rebellion online, depending. I know some of you are not in England, or some friends of mine wrote and said, I'm going to listen to you, and I know you're in other countries. Sorry, I don't have a list of participants who are here, but wherever you are, there's almost certainly a climate activist group that will suit the kind of action you want to take. Because what is astonishing and what really gives me hope is the diversity of groups. And one of the things I like about, you know, I listened to a sort of strategy meeting of Extinction Rebellion recently. One of the messages it's pushing, which I really appreciate, is build relationships between movements, make friends, reach out, so that everybody can find the space that works for them. If you want to join your wildlife trust and be working to save the bit of countryside around you, that is direct action. It's not, you know, it's wonderful. It's not all about breaking the law and sitting in the road. Non-violent direct action includes making sure that beavers can live in your local river and letting people know about it and letting people know why that is life-saving. So find the space to work in which you work. Are there more questions? No.
Yes,
we're fine. Let's go on for another 10 minutes.
Okay, so there's one from Jess.
Whatever.
That says, in the context of that decentralization, do you ever worry that many groups working on the same broad issue can confuse the message?
I don't quite understand the question. So, I mean, when she was,
well, I suppose
for example, just answered that in a sense. I feel I just answered that because I think it's really good if we build relationships. I mean, again, didn't get any much press coverage, because that's the nature of things. But last year, the big Extinction Rebellion action was about building relationships. And out on the same street, outside Parliament, was Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion. I can't remember all the groups, but people were talking to each other about different ways of working. And I thought that it's Friends of the Earth that are taking, I can't remember the details, that are taking the government to court, involved in climate litigation. You know, Chris Packham is taking the government to court. Separately is getting a judicial review for their reversal on net zero. Different people are doing different things, and we need to know about each other and support each other. That doesn't mean we have to sign some charter that we all agree with everything that everybody else does. That's my view anyway.
Yeah,
it's not like sign this, and if you don't agree, you're not part of it.
Yeah, it came across in that example.
Collaboration.
Around XR and the DLR line action, and that generally most affinity groups wouldn't have had conflicting feelings about the action that was taken on the overground, and whether or not.
Well, that's a long time ago. So now we're in a different. Are there actions that I think? Yeah, I mean, that's a good example of an action that many of us thought was a mistake. I wasn't personally involved in the action. Like everybody else, I was polled. One affinity group is thinking of blocking the Docklands Light Railway. What do you think? And I said I didn't think it was a good idea. And I think 75% of those polled said, but the affinity group decided to go ahead. And you saw the press coverage that followed was very negative, pointing out that it, far from being propaganda by deed, it didn't seem the messaging was confused. It's interesting that, as I understand, the people involved in that action were acquitted. And you have to acknowledge that. But I think we all learned a lot from that action. And my own affinity group decided to do an action in Cornwall, welcoming people, we're at the end of the line in Penzance, welcoming people off the train and thanking them for taking the train. So we did what I think it was, we did a positive action to try and make it clear that, you know, traveling by train was a really good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I did enjoy in the book was those moments of things that hadn't quite worked, that we learn as much from as the success stories. I want to put together two questions here that I think work well together. One is from Tom, which is, have you noticed people working inside the fossil fuel industry changing their feelings about working for these companies, including leaving their jobs? And connected with this idea of people working within the industry, Shane has asked the question, do you have red lines on who you would and wouldn't work with? You personally, I think it means.
I don't quite understand the red line question. So I'll talk to anyone. I mean, I spent my life at Greenham talking to soldiers on the other side of the fence, because I think communication can have an effect. I handed out leaflets on Salisbury Plain asking them to think about not doing what they were doing. I'm one of those irritating, you know, when I was arrested, I would talk for hours there's one of the diaries documents a long conversation with policemen in the van, because I think people can change. So I'm not going to refuse to talk. I mean, I accept the kind of Netpol and Extinction Rebellion guidance on being careful what you say and, you know, not. But I think communication, what is nonviolent direct action if it's not about communication and trying to change things? I put a question. I went to the Shell AGM because I wanted to talk to Shell executives. And I tried. They didn't answer. They didn't listen. But given the chance to sit down in a bar with one, I would do so and say, look, why are you doing what you're doing? And do you realize the damage you're doing? And when you maybe finding the language to cut through, what about your children? What do you know, I personally have spent my life working in conflicts and disasters. And when I look back at most of them, I go to Darfur and Chad in 2004, and I'm working with starving people who've crossed a border from a genocidal war that at its root has the destruction of the environment in which they're living by climate change, so that people are fighting over it and killing each other. And fossil fuel industries have a role in that genocide. Does that matter to you? Do these people matter? So, you know, we are changing. I'd say, well, actually, you're not changing. You just reverse direction, you know, and I want to have the conversation. I want to have the conversation. If we give up having the conversation, we're lost, because what other methods are there? Nonviolent direct action is a conversation.
In the context of red lines and who you, in terms of, for example, accepting a platform. So if Shell was sponsoring a stage and then saying,
it may be that you need, I mean, but boycotts and non-cooperation divestment are saying, I won't talk to you at this moment strategically to show something. So I mean, I you know, I would love it. Maybe we should all refuse to use, I've had it knocked down, you know, supposing we all boycotted one fossil fuel provider, but then all the others would get, in the meantime, they'd probably get extra. So I don't know how you work that, but I think if you're having boycotts and non-cooperation, they're strategic forms of pressure. That doesn't mean you can't talk to the individuals running those companies. I think not talking to them about why you're boycotting them actually would not work. Do I love Michaela Loach's and Greta? Well, I love what Greta Thunberg said last year. I'm not going to the Edinburgh Book Festival. Very powerful, because she's a well-known person. Michaela Loach went to the festival and then organized an action within it, also very powerful. And then writers wrote and said, we're in an impossible situation. So do we have a dialogue? I don't have the answers, but I think all three matter, probably with something like Baillie Gifford. In a sense, that letter the school children wrote to the RSC was a dialogue, okay?
Yeah.
And so it takes everything.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's that beautiful line that you end the book on. Was it drops of water break the rock, and we need waterfalls.
That's it. My husband is Ethiopian, and that's a very famous. He keeps saying that to me. I say, "Oh God, it's not going to work." He says, "Lynne, drops of water break the rock," which is true. But I think we need a lot of drops of water, and so that's why my last line of the book is, "We need waterfalls. We need all of us." And so talking to your neighbors and persuading them. And that's why, by the way, it's not when the fossil fuel companies and the government say, well, it's up to individuals. If they would just change their ways, the world will change. Well, to an extent, they're right, but it's not up to us alone. Individual action counts because individual action is infectious, but it's not enough. So I haven't bought, except for underwear, I haven't bought new clothes for years. And I love the recycle your clothing, don't buy new stuff. I love the fact that some prominent fashion people are coming out on that and saying they haven't. It's not enough. We have to take on the clothing industry as a whole and the use of plastic. But it leads to a conversation. And then, I say to mine, well, it's great that we're doing this, but now we've got to push our MP to insist on legislation that addresses this issue. So it can't be left up to us. We've got to get governments to change. And that's why we need the pressure.
Yeah, I love that. There's a question here from Paula who says, was there any action that worked that you thought was really unlikely to work?
I thought we were unlikely to get rid of cruise missiles, to be honest. So, and I did go back to work and thinking, well, I'll keep going up there and keep trying. And then it did. I mean, that's often how it happens. You think it's not going to work and it's not going to work, and then it does. Okay. And the same with apartheid. So it suddenly things cascade at the last minute. The same with I can remember the moment. I'd been in Poland, it'd been really hard. I had friends in prison because another action I describe in the book they were doing was refusing the military oath, which the Russians had imposed on all Polish soldiers. Polish soldiers are very patriotic, and it was very clever. They weren't refusing military service. They were refusing to take an oath of loyalty to the Soviet Union, and they wanted that oath removed. And initially they'd been ignored, but then during this very difficult period, they started being put in prison. And then suddenly in 1988, it changed, and the oath was dropped, and Solidarity MPs were elected, and then people were getting across the border. Things suddenly cascade. I can't explain fully the dynamics, but it is extraordinary. So what I would say is don't give up. Shall I just read that last paragraph?
Yes.
Because I began this book with Greta Thunberg, who's an inspiration to me, and so lovely that she came across to protest with us at the Oily Money demonstrations last October. And so I end with her. In her climate book, which, by the way, I noticed a couple of years ago, it's a wonderful resource. I gave it to every member of my family and friends for Christmas when it came out. She sums up what she believes transformation requires. Individual action and systemic change work hand in hand. We need both. Any suggestion that we can have one without the other, or that any single solution or idea is more important than all the others, is pretty much guaranteed to be aimed at slowing us down. We as individuals should use our voices and whatever platforms we have to become activists and communicate the urgency of the situation to those around us. We should all become active citizens and hold the people in power accountable for their actions and their inaction. Drops of water break the rock, as Mama reminds me. This is an emergency. We need waterfalls. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that.
The inspiration.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, thank you for the book. I think it could not have come at a better time, and it is so urgently needed and such a breath of fresh air. and a brilliant tool. So thank you for bringing that. I think
My
we are
pleasure.
out of time. But fortunately, you've gone and written a book. So if you are at home watching this and you wanted more and you have more questions, there is so much more. I've got a proof, but it's now a very pretty hardback. Do get,
Yeah,
sorry for
I
the
have the
inconvenience.
hardback.
There we go.
No, it's coming out wrong. There we go.
Sorry for the
I don't know how
inconvenience.
you show it so that it doesn't come up. Does it? Yeah, it's
I
coming
can see
out.
it right for you. I think mine's coming. But yeah, wherever you get it, you can use your voucher tonight for your ticket on the website, and we can send it to you wherever you are, or pop into the shop. And that leaves me all to send you off into the night to go and do good things, to dig where you are, to be those drops of water, and to thank you again for joining us. And will you all at home raise a glass, put your hands together, to Lynne Jones. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
I'm so sorry I can't see you all, but thank you for coming, whoever and wherever you are, and stay in touch. And yeah,
Brilliant.
if you had a question it didn't get answered, feel
Mhm.
free to email Mary, and I will do my best to answer it. She'll pass it on to me. Okay. Is
Okay,
that
brilliant.
okay?